Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Sandwich Public Library. My name is Matthew Jones, and I'm the Adult Services Coordinator here at the library. Thanks for tuning in to this virtual event that we are so excited to be hosting and so privileged to be hosting in partnership with the Illinois Humanities Road Speakers Bureau. Our guest tonight is Megan Klein, and her presentation is Family Detention on the Ground. We are privileged to hear from her on this topic, not simply as the expert that she is in an idea sort of conceptual way, but from her own experience and the stories that she has lived and will share with us tonight. So we're very excited to hear from her vantage point on this conversation. I'm going to read a welcome to you that comes from our friends at the Illinois Humanities Road Scholars Speaker Bureau. They say, hello and welcome. Thank you for attending. The mission of the Illinois Humanities is to strengthen the social, political, and economic fabric of Illinois through constructive conversation and civic engagement. Our Road Scholars Speakers Bureau supports that mission by inviting Illinois authors, artists, and scholars to share their expertise and enthusiasm with people and communities throughout our state. After this event, we hope you'll complete the audience feedback survey, which will help us as we plan future programs and seek support for our work. To learn about other Road Scholar presentations or other programs and grant opportunities, please visit www.ilhumanities.org. We hope you enjoy the presentation. And we here at the Sandwich Library also hope you enjoy. And I would ask for you to participate in that survey. A good survey response helps us to provide this program at a low cost for the library and show that it's having a good impact. I've dropped the link to that survey in the chat, so you can see that survey link. And if you would fill that out, it's a brief 9-question multiple choice survey that you can fill out after the program. With all of those announcements out of the way, I want to welcome Megan and thank her for being with us tonight. Welcome, Megan Klein.
Hi, thank you so much. And thank you all for having me tonight. I really appreciate the opportunity. And as nice as it is to gather virtually, I'm sorry that I can't be there in Sandwich, as I have never been before and would love to visit. It looks lovely outside the library. So thank you all for having me. I am going to go ahead and share my screen, so I have some slides to talk with you about this evening. And so let me just do that. I was just saying before, now that we're about over a year and a half into the pandemic, I feel much more competent with Zoom. So hopefully that stays true tonight. My presentation tonight is entitled Family Detention on the Ground. And as Matthew mentioned, my name is Megan Klein, and I am an associate professor of anthropology and sociology at Oakton Community College, which is a community college northwest of Chicago in Des Plaines, Illinois. And I actually started at Oakton 15 years ago as a Spanish professor. And so my experiences that I'll be sharing with you tonight and talking about tonight are very much rooted in my Spanish, my ability to speak Spanish. So that is something I started with at Oakton as well. So I'd like to just give a general outline, and I am going to try and go through this quickly for me so that hopefully we can have time for question and answer at the end. But what I would ask is if you do have questions at any point, I won't be able to see the chat until I stop sharing my screen, but please feel free to type those questions into the chat. And in the event that we don't have time live here to talk question and answer after the talk, I'm more than happy to send an email with some responses and ideas. So hopefully that's a good way of doing question and answer, because we might not have enough time for it, but we may. We'll see. I just know when I'm listening to a talk, I have a question usually 10 minutes in, and then I wait till the end, I'll forget it. So please don't feel like you have to wait. Go ahead and type it in the chat. I just won't see it until the end. So I just want to give a brief outline of the talk tonight. I first want to start with some geography. We hear about immigration all the time. We hear about things like the Northern Triangle and, Central America and unaccompanied minors and so on and so forth. And I want to take some time to kind of make sure that we all are sharing the same kind of foundation, at least with respect to geography, some acronyms. I think those are helpful ways of just getting us started. I do want to then talk about a few specific stories that have really stuck with me. So, three profiles of women that I worked with when I was down at the South Texas Family Residential Center in Dilley, Texas. So after I talk about some of their stories, I will also describe the facility where I worked, talk about the day-to-day work that I engaged in when I was there, and then talk about kind of all of this within a framework of seeking asylum and what that actually looks like, um, as well as kind of consider some policy regarding immigration. I have a couple of books that might be of interest to folks who are interested in the topic of immigration, especially thinking about migration as as something that will be with us for a long time, I guess, to say it that way. And then I want to end on some moments of hope. I'm going to be sharing some experiences and some stories that are, they're hard to hear. It's hard to hear about human suffering. It was certainly very difficult doing the work in the detention center. But I did find really incredible moments of hope throughout that week. So I do want to share those because I think those are really essential as well. So that is the plan. So as I said, I wanted to start off with some information on geography, and I think it's really essential to kind of orient this in what's often referred to as the Northern Triangle countries. So here I have this map, and I decided to include a map that actually maps the homicide rates as of 2016 in Central America, because that really speaks to a lot of what the women I worked with were experiencing and really was the impetus for their decision to try and immigrate and seek asylum in the United States. So when you hear about the Northern Triangle countries, that's referring to a set of countries in Central America, specifically referring to Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, sometimes Nicaragua as well. Belize, although you don't see quite as many migrants from Belize, there certainly are some coming from Belize. But Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua were the primary countries where immigrants were kind of hailing from when I was doing the work in 2018. And I think these countries are really important to spend a little bit more time on, because what we can see in these countries is that they have a really high homicide rate. And those homicide rates, if you're not familiar with homicide rates, are very, very high relative to the United States as a whole. But even relative to larger cities, even relative to the kind of surge in homicides that we've seen, for example, here in Chicago and across some cities as part of the pandemic. And I think it's also important to note that these are as of 2016, but have undoubtedly gotten much higher as a result of economic conditions, climate change, which we'll talk about just briefly, and the pandemic, which of course has hit everyone, not excluding the Northern Triangle countries. And so there's a term that I think is a really appropriate one, which is coined by an author that I'll reference at the end of the talk, Christian Parenti. And he talks about this catastrophic convergence of violence and poverty that we tend to see. He calls it the Tropic of Chaos, kind of right around the equator. And that's exacerbated by climate change or global warming. And so I could see this very much in the stories that the women migrants told me about their lives and the lives of their children. So you have pretty significant poverty, especially, you especially see that in the rural Western highlands of Guatemala, but you see it in the cities as well. Um, there's also, when we talk about this convergence of poverty and violence, there was tremendous discussion and many really difficult to hear stories about that violence perpetrated, especially by gangs. And I heard about gangs like the Barrio 18 gang, the MS-13 or Mareros. So that's the Mara Salvatrucha, which is a gang that, there's been information and stories written about them here in the United States. They're fairly notorious. So that's a name that some of you may be familiar with. And in some cases, especially in Honduras, where you saw kind of the convergence of two gangs in specific neighborhoods. There's also, the women that I worked with were all in a family detention center, which means that they were there with their child or their children. Children under the age of 18. And many of the women talked about the scarcity of resources. So despite all efforts, they were unable to put food on the table, to make ends meet, really, but not even just making ends meet, just like even being able to provide basic necessities. So I think that idea of the catastrophic convergence is a really useful one for framing the stories that women shared with me. I also want to talk about some terms and acronyms. So these are kind of tossed around and I'll use them, and I just want to make sure that everyone knows them. Some of these might be very familiar to you, so I apologize if it's redundant. When I say CBP, I'm talking about Customs and Border Patrol. And these are the agents that patrol the border, as the name suggests, and they will, pick up or detain migrants and then bring them to the Customs and Border Patrol facilities. And so if you've seen some of the images of really overcrowded, pretty terrible conditions that might have been taking place in these Customs and Border Patrol facilities, which are really designed as holding facilities. People aren't supposed to spend more than about 72 hours there before they're sent to a center or a detention facility like the one that I worked in, and I'll talk about in just a minute. ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Again, that's an acronym that's used in the immigration world. I think that's probably one that's pretty familiar to people. But these are, agents that carry out the enforcement of immigration laws. Oftentimes, when we are hearing about ICE, it's in terms of, certainly like workplace raids. That would be ICE agents carrying out workplace raids. You'll often see ICE agents at checkpoints, customs, etc. CCA or core civic, those are two terms referring to the same, not the same for-profit private prison corporation. If you've seen documentaries on mass incarceration, you're probably familiar with core civic or CCA, as they are really one of the largest private prison corporations. And their role at the detention facility in Dilley, Texas, this South Texas Family Residential Center, is basically day-to-day operations. So they are running this detention facility, which is really kind of like the, detention facility jail for immigrants. And so, there's all sorts of questions about privatization of prison, of enforcing and kind of doing the day-to-day work in these detention facilities. But that's not going to really be a part of the scope of the talk tonight, unless you have questions. But I just want you to know what that was referring to. The UNHCR, I will get into this a little bit later, which is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And this is the kind of global, decision-making body coming up with policy and suggestions around seeking asylum. So they come up with their criteria for seeking asylum, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. These are two Spanish words, hielera and perrera, and they're connected with CBP. So as I mentioned, when Border Patrol agents pick up immigrants without documentation, folks trying to cross without documentation into the United States, they'll take them to these holding facilities. And the women that I worked with, and this is much more widely used as well beyond just the specific women I worked with, refer to these holding facilities as the hielera or the icebox, or the perrera or the dog pound, because of the conditions. So they talked about certain kind of holding cells that were kept really, really, really cold. The women I worked with had crossed via the Rio Grande River in November. Many were dealing with, sicknesses, colds, things like that. This was pre-COVID, but still kind of general flu, colds, etc., especially exacerbated by crossing a cold river in November. And so the temperatures were kept really artificially low. Often women and children were given very little in terms of blankets and protective gear. You've seen those pictures with the aluminum blankets, and I have one of those as well from Human Rights Watch. The perrera are other options in these facilities, in these holding facilities. So if you've seen those images of kind of the chain link fence, the chain link fence that kind of has people behind it, oftentimes really crowded conditions, especially pre-pandemic. That's the dog pound, which is another way of describing, or a term that's used to describe these facilities. And then I'm going to talk about credible fear primarily. One of the things that one has to do when seeking asylum is have a judge rule on whether or not they have a credible fear of going back to their home country. If they are determined to have a credible fear, then they are able to kind of continue with the proceedings of asylum. So that is an important term, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. Okay, so I have a few pictures. These are not my pictures, and I point that out because I was not able to take pictures while I was there. In fact, the project with which I worked, the Proyecto Dilley, formerly known as the Dilley Pro Bono Project, is a group that provides free legal counsel to women and children while they are detained, while they're in the Dilley Detention Center, the South Texas Family Residential Center. Um, this is a family jail. It has capacity for 2,400. And while I was there, I shouldn't get too scattered here. I said I couldn't take photos. In fact, the Core Civic, the folks that are running the prison, this private prison corporation, said that if any photos are taken, that could actually compromise this entire project, which no one wanted to do, of course. So I listened. I'm a rule follower. I did not take any pictures, but there are some pictures out there, and so I felt like it helps to give a sense of the facility. So as I said, it has capacity for about 2,400 people. In August of 2019, so pre-pandemic, there were about 900 women and children there at the time. When I was there in November of 2018, the facility it had quite a few people. I wasn't able to determine exact numbers, but there was really an attempt to kind of be clearing it out at that time. And I'll talk more about that in just a minute. So this facility actually opened in 2014 under then President Obama. And currently, Joe Biden's plan with this facility is to transform it into what has been called a rapid processing hub. So that would be a place where migrants can get processed and get those asylum proceedings happening theoretically within 72 hours. Now, I will say when I was there, there were women and children that had been detained for over 5 months. I'm going to talk about a few of them in just a minute. So the idea of doing that processing within 72 hours, especially with some pretty significant backlogs in immigration courts, is hard to imagine. But that certainly is what has been put out there as a possibility. I've got another picture here. Basically, the facility is this sort of series of trailers that are, of course, behind barbed wire. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that looked like, sort of day to day and how we were able to operate there. So I'm a little out of order with my slides. I want to just get to this picture because this is actually a scene that was really replicated every single day, 3 times a day while I was there. And I'll talk more about that day-to-day work in just a minute. But as I said, I wanted to center the stories and give you a few kind of case studies, examples of women that I worked with while I was there, so that when we work through and talk about some of the policies and things like that, we have real human faces and their stories to kind of think about. I don't actually have pictures of them because, as I said, I couldn't take those, but I hopefully will paint a picture of some of the stories and the conditions from which women were coming. So the first woman that I worked with, her name was Angelica, and again, I have changed names. She fled from Guatemala with her 2 daughters, who at the time were 14 and 16. So I met all 3 of them and was working with them as a group. She crossed into the United States in November. She crossed into the United States in actually May of 2018 via the Rio Grande. And she was seeking asylum because she had been treated as property since she was 3 years old when her mother passed away. So she moved from abusive household, so lived with relatives when her mother passed away, relatives who treated her really as property, almost as an indentured servant, were abusive, and she lived with, moved from abusive household to abusive household until she was about 18, at which point she moved in with a boyfriend who was also abusive, and she suffered abuse and extortion through her 2 pregnancies. She was threatened repeatedly. She was sexually assaulted repeatedly. She sought protection from the police, but to no avail. She was not She was not able to get the protection that she needed to survive and thrive in her home country of Guatemala. And so it was under these circumstances and this fear for her own children's safety, both physical safety as well as mental safety, that she made that very difficult decision um, to embark on this long journey, this long and arduous journey to the United States to try and seek asylum. Um, Another young mother that I met, and again, all the women I worked with were mothers, and they were there with at least one child, if not more than one child. So another young mother, Marta, ran something called a pulperia out of her house. And a pulperia, I think it's a very Honduran term. It's not really a term that I had been familiar with before working with women from Honduras. But a pulperia is like a little snack shop that many women try to run out of their homes to try and scrape together some earnings in a place where it's very difficult to find paid employment. So each morning, in order to get what she needed to make the sandwiches and other snacks that she sold at her pulperia, she would walk to the market. And Honduras, in some parts, it's very dangerous to simply be a woman and go out about your daily life without essentially without a male chaperone, without a significant other, a father, a boyfriend, a husband, etc. And so Martha was a single mother with a young 2-year-old son who was quite vulnerable. And so, as she was running her daily errands, one day a man in a really fancy car approached her and started talking with her. He started doing this kind of every day as she was walking to her, to the market from her house and back. And one day he asked her out on a date, and she politely declined. And she told me that, she obviously had some idea that he was engaged in illicit behavior based on the car. Um, and so when she said no, he began really stalking and harassing her. So he would kind of follow her. He started calling her, even though she had never given him her phone number. And then one day, as she was walking to the market, he and another man forced her into the car, and then they drove out into the countryside. And she told me of how he attempted to sexually assault her, but found that she was menstruating at the time. And so he pushed her out of a moving car and spat on her. And when she was able to make her way back to her home and seek support and protection from the police, she was not able to get the support that she needed. And this man continued to harass her and stalk her. She tried to move with her young son to Costa Rica, but he actually found her in Costa Rica. He knew where she was living. So it was at that point that she decided she had to get much further away. And so she decided to embark upon this, again, treacherous journey to the United States to try and seek asylum. And then finally, one other woman that I worked with, one other mother, her name, I'm calling her Andrea, and she was there with her son, Tomas. And Tomas was kind of unusual because he stayed with his mom really the whole time. So a lot of the kids would, there were spaces for them to color and to, watch TV. There was a lot of SpongeBob on the television. And Tomas really stuck by his mother's side the whole time. And I was really moved by Andrea. Her story was not much different from others, seeking to flee really tremendous conditions that she was living in Guatemala. She was also from Guatemala. But her situation at the time, she had been detained for 5 months, was just so desperate. So she talked of tremendous medical issues that she had that wasn't getting attention for. It was clear, I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist, but it was clear that she was dealing with depression and anxiety, and those were very much exacerbated or triggered by this detention. She, like these other mothers, had actually been forcibly separated from her child. So she and Tomas had been detained. And if you recall, in June of 2018, that was when the zero tolerance policy was put in place by then President Donald Trump to separate families as this attempt at deterring future migrants. So women and children that were together in this facility were separated without any knowledge of where their children were sent to. And they were separated for a period of time without knowledge of their child or their children. So Andrea and Tomas had been separated and reunited, like the other two women that I had just spoken about, Angelica and Marta. They had been reunited, and in fact, when I was there, there were 38 families that had been separated from their children back in June, July of 2018, had been reunited and were still being detained. So they had all been there for about 5 months. Um, my my responsibilities that week with respect to this group of reunited families was to be reaching out to their sponsors and trying to get everything in place for them to be released as part of this process of seeking asylum. And I'll talk more about them in part of the moments of hope later. So not to give a spoiler there, but there are some really impressive moments of hope with respect to this group. So I'm just going to go back here. Sorry, I don't mean to be skipping around, but I just want to have a picture up when I talk a little bit about the facility. As I mentioned, this was a very much like a jail-like settings. You know, no cell phones allowed in. You have to carry in all your stuff in a clear plastic bag, etc. Very little access to phone calls for the women, and they were absolutely detained and had very few freedoms, no control over really their time, things like that. So each day, as I said, I worked with the women that had been detained for 5 months, but I also worked with women that were just coming in. And so one of my primary responsibilities as a volunteer there, who was not an immigration attorney, but who speaks Spanish and who has years of experience doing interviewing for sociology and anthropology and data collection, I led groups of women. These were called charlas. And these were opportunities for us to meet the women who were entering the facility, the detention facility, find a time to set up a one-on-one meeting for them with their immigration attorney so that they could prep for their credible fear interview. And then, as they were getting closer to their release, prepare them for the legal processes once they were released. And so each morning at 8 a.m., at 11 a.m., at 1 p.m., at 4 p.m., and at 7 p.m. So there were 5 a day. We would host these welcome charlas, or charla number one. And charla in Spanish means like a chat or conversation. So the first one, women had just gotten here. They had some paperwork that they had been given at Customs and Border Patrol, and they really didn't know exactly what was going on. And so our responsibilities at that time were to talk with them, to do some advocacy work and find out about the conditions at Customs and Border Patrol. Did they have food? Were they given blankets? We were able to also do some advocacy work because even in moments when that sort of acute family separation is not happening, families are separated every day at the border. So men are sent to men's prisons, women are sent to women's prisons. Children, if they're not biologically the children of the parents, they'll be labeled unaccompanied minors and sent somewhere else. And so this kind of family separation is happening every day. So we would find out, did you cross with anyone else that's not here with you at Dilley? And we would try and do some advocacy work to try and link their cases in the system. And that really literally involved guessing at what the immigration number for their significant other, their husband, or their son, who is over 18 might have been. So it's a 9-digit number that starts with A. If we knew their country of origin, we could like type in, 5 or 10 numbers below the woman's number and 5 or 10 above and see if we could find a match and get their cases linked in the system. So it really was like that kind of level of trying to advocate for them. The goal of this first conversation was to get them to sign paperwork to allow for the immigration attorneys as part of this project to provide free legal counsel to them. Folks are like significantly more likely to get positive findings on their credible fear interviews and thus be allowed to continue to try and seek asylum if they are represented or have legal counsel. And so the goal is to provide everyone that's detained in this facility with free legal counsel so that they are as well prepared as they can be. So that's really the first charla. The second charla, again, imagine having 5 of these per day happening so that you can get a sense of the kind of revolving door of people coming in. The second one is to do that credible fear prep. And this is the much more intense process. So these were, often 1 to 2 hour visits with, in my case, me and an immigration attorney, where we were interviewing the woman about her reasons for seeking asylum. And I'm going to talk in just a minute about the criteria for seeking asylum, because that's pretty narrow in terms of what is possible for seeking asylum. So preparing the women to present in front of an immigration judge. Um, and again, these were the moments where they were telling us really their trauma, their experiences, and what led them to take this incredibly momentous, huge decision to leave their family, leave their homeland, leave everything that's comfortable for them to try and seek asylum in a country that was openly hostile, at least at a governmental level, to immigrants at the time. And then the third and final charla was a sort of more positive charla, because it was the one where we were preparing women who had been set to be released from the detention facility. They had received positive findings on their credible fear interviews, and they would be released from the Dilley detention facility, and sent off to somewhere in the United States to live with their sponsor. And sponsors were often family members that were already in the United States. Friends, etc. Someone willing to be responsible for this woman and her children financially, as well as sort of legally, and so on. Um, so that was kind of the day-to-day work. It also involved various kind of meetings and advocating for individual women on a case-by-case basis as necessary. So whether that was advocacy work around getting appropriate medical care, many of the women talked about, and again, this was pre-COVID, talked about going to the infirmary with a child that had a very high fever, and just getting some Tylenol, and that was sort of the end of it. So there really wasn't great medical care, especially in more serious cases. So I want to go back to this slide, which talks a little bit about the criteria for seeking asylum. And I'm trying to be cognizant of time, so hopefully we can have a minute or two at the end for questions. So this is the criteria more globally, right? Immigration is certainly not just a U.S. issue, and as we know, more and more people will be embarking on migration journeys, especially as we think about the consequences of climate change. So as of right now, there are 5 different categories upon which someone can seek asylum, and the top 4: race, nationality, religion, and political opinion, tend to be the strongest footings or foundations for a positive finding on that credible fear interview, or credible fear prep. So if a woman talked about being persecuted in her home country based on her race, we would certainly try and help her tell her story in a way that highlighted that. If a woman was seeking to stay in the United States and seek asylum because she was being persecuted in her home country based on her nationality, again, that's a pretty firm footing for seeking asylum. Religion was another example, and I did have a few women who were actually Jehovah's Witnesses, and the church, for them, the church leaders had been very vocal against gangs, and so because they were identified as belonging to a church that was openly against the gangs, that often led to troubles for individuals who identify as or participate in Jehovah's Witnesses, or who are Jehovah's Witnesses. That could lead to some safety and precarity for them, vulnerability. And so there were 2 women that had been extorted and kind of stalked and harassed based on their religion. Political opinion is another one. At this time, we saw a few immigrants from countries like Venezuela and Cuba, but that was certainly not, the political opinion piece was not as much a part of the stories of the women from the Northern Triangle countries. And then this last group is a bit amorphous. It's not really tethered to any one experience, but I put LGBTQ plus here because folks have been able to make a case coming both from Northern Triangle countries, but also countries, I think of like Chechnya, for example, where the president, the leader of Chechnya, is very anti-gay, anti-lesbian, very homophobic, and has put in policies that are really are criminalizing LGBTQ as an identity. And so, if you're coming from a country that is openly hostile toward LGBTQ identities, then that has been successfully sought. So that has been a successful basis for seeking asylum in the past. Another example that has found some success, but isn't quite as strong of a case as, for example, race, nationality, religion, or political opinion, is again being a member of a particular social group and experiencing domestic violence as a result. So, really, as I mentioned, being a woman in Honduras, a single mother in Honduras, put you in a particular social group that led you to be pretty precarious and vulnerable as just a human. And so many of the women were able to talk about pretty traumatic patterns of abuse. It really did have to be kind of a long time pattern of abuse, of being treated as property. And so that was certainly a part of the stories of many women. Unfortunately, the way that seeking asylum, the criteria work, it doesn't allow for asylum to be sought based on economic reasons alone. And so when women would talk about their stories and kind of highlight this desire um, to provide a better life for their children, we would have to be fairly, certainly not that we believe this, but kind of share with them the callousness of this, because that's not really a criteria for seeking asylum. And so if that's the only part of their story, that's not going to get them a credible fear of a positive finding on their credible fear interview. So it was really about helping them to highlight the parts of their story that we could fit into one of these categories. And really, all of them did have stories that fit into these categories. It was just a matter of kind of helping them to tell their stories in that way. I do put down here, what about climate change? Because we know in some cases, in the case of some women that I worked with, an inability to grow the food that they've historically grown in the Western Highlands of Guatemala was one reason for migrating to the city and then really trying to migrate to the United States. There are other countries, not the Northern Triangle countries, that may not even exist. I think of like the atoll countries and island nations. In the next decades, 20, 30, 40 years. And so if the loss of one's homeland due to climate change isn't a criteria, that could be a real problem moving forward. So I just put that out there to kind of keep that on your radar. Um, so so these were stories again that we were able to help them prepare for their credible fear interview, and then help them prepare for that asylum process, which is a very long-term process once they are released uh, from the detention facility. So I did want to just kind of update this in terms of COVID. So I was there before COVID. So I was working with women in this detention facility in kind of, I guess, the best of times, I suppose. At the time that I was there, a proclamation had just been issued to really try and clear out the detention facility. And so that was November 9th of 2018. And then President Donald Trump said that at that point, he issued a proclamation. It was after 5 p.m. on a Friday, after close of business. And the proclamation basically said, if you attempt to enter the United States at an illegal port of entry, you won't be allowed to seek asylum. And that might sound reasonable. Like, why wouldn't you just enter at a legal port of entry? But the reality is that, of course, at a legal port of entry, you can't enter, essentially. There's all sorts of tactics involved to keep people out. And so the desperation comes in an attempt to try and get to the United States by any means necessary. So all of the women that I worked with had crossed the Rio Grande. So at that time, there was this attempt to clear out the facility. So it was, I would say, slightly under capacity. Well, for sure under capacity on the less full side. But we've seen a real uptick in the number of immigrants, and that's particularly difficult because of the pandemic and the public health issues. So at one point in 2020, a federal judge ruled that the detention, there's a slight typo there, that the Dilley detention facility was, quote, on fire due to COVID-19. And that was really rooted in the communal settings, the lack of vaccinations at that time, and still kind of spotty vaccination of migrants today, as well as these really overcrowded conditions and an inability to physically and socially distance from people. As I mentioned before, there was inadequate medical care before the pandemic, and so that really continued. But with more people sick, it became even more and more difficult to access. So the COVID pandemic has had all sorts of policy implications, which I'll talk about. And I think, let's see, time-wise, okay, couple more minutes. So, a few things in terms of kind of current considerations. This is just some ideas about what can work and how we can think about it moving forward. But I do want to just talk about kind of current policies. So I say policy can work. Unfortunately, the kinds of policies that we have in place right now are really exacerbating the problem. So number one, we in the United States, we know we really have a desperate need for workers, especially in the service industry, and yet we are creating policies that are making it so much more difficult for folks to both come to the United States, seek asylum, and then get work permits and work visas while they're waiting for this asylum process to play out, which can take years and years and years. Um, Something called Title 42, which is a public health policy, was a policy put into place by Donald Trump. It was supposed to be lifted. By the Biden administration in the summer of 2021. But because of the Delta variant and the uptick in COVID cases, the Biden administration decided to continue to turn away migrants under Title 42. They haven't enforced this rule against unaccompanied minors that were arriving at the border. So, if you recall a few months ago, seeing those images of children just being left by their parents, which seems horrific, and it certainly is. But again, being between kind of a rock and a hard place, if your child can get in as an unaccompanied minor and then get to family in the United States, again, out of these very desperate conditions, perhaps that might be the lesser of two really terrible evils. Um, ICE just recently added 1,200 more beds to detention facilities like Dilley. So again, there's an attempt to try and create more capacity, but it's creating more capacity in these detention facilities, which again, many people and many organizations have really pushed to abolish, getting rid of these detention facilities altogether. There's so much confusion about who is allowed in and who isn't. More than 33% of folks who were caught crossing the border without documentation were repeat crossers, meaning they're crossing again and again. And that could be certainly, again, desperation, but also a lack of kind of understanding and confusion around who is able to come in and who is not. Um, in June of this year, the Custom and Border Patrol numbers were incredibly high. So they documented 188,000, more than 188,000 encounters between border officials and migrants, which is a new high. It's also happening at a time when fewer people tend to cross because of the oppressive heat. So typically in the summer months, those crossings go down because of the heat, but we saw record highs. Um, as I mentioned before, the High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR, has called on the Biden administration to end the use of Title 42. When Title 42, though, was lifted for children earlier this year, there simply weren't enough beds for those children. And so that's when we saw some of those really horrific images of children crammed into the Customs and Border Patrol cells. We also saw Vice President Kamala Harris visit the Northern Triangle countries. Specifically, she visited Guatemala and was really focused on um, uh, how can we support countries in their efforts to keep migrants at home, right? It's not that, she's really trying to look at it from this side of what can we do to support improving conditions of migrants at home. Um, that might make sense, certainly, but that's a much more long-term processual solution. It's not going to stop this really significant amount of people that are coming to the border really every day. Again, just some of those numbers, some 26,000 folks were detained in early July, and that's compared with 14,000 in April. And virus cases were really surging during the summer months among mostly unvaccinated migrants in these crowded facilities. And only about 1 in 5 had received at least one COVID vaccination at that time. Now, again, the availability of the vaccination, getting people vaccinated, we've seen increases in the ability to do that, but it's pretty spotty in detention facilities like Dilley. So keeping all that in mind, policy it can work, but we have to be proactive in our policy as opposed to reactive. And I have a picture down here of the caravan in 2018 that was making its way to the United States, and that was the kind of policies that were put into place to try and clear out space for this caravan were much more reactive, and therefore ended up being much more inhumane and pretty horrific, had pretty horrific consequences for migrants who were crossing without documentation at a very specific point in time. I have a couple of books here. One in particular that was just published in 2020 called The Next Great Migration. And what the author here, Sonia Shaw, does is work to reframe migration as life saving. So we tend to think of migration as kind of anomalous, but what she does in this look at migration throughout human and non-human history is look at the conditions under which someone is seeking to migrate from where they're comfortable to this new place, and what those conditions are and how they might allow for an individual, whether that individual is, like I said, human or non-human. She does get into different species, um, be able to survive, and not only survive but thrive in this new environment. What I hope to do with this talk is to start to humanize migrants. We tend to talk about immigration at the macro level, and we really lose sight of, or it becomes very kind of disconnected, or it's not quite as tethered to the individual stories and the individual cases, and the individual people themselves. When I talk with my students about immigration, I ask them to really kind of put themselves in the shoes of someone who decides to immigrate. And in fact, many of my students are immigrants themselves, or their parents are immigrants, and really think about what are those conditions that would lead someone to leave, again, everything that's familiar to them, to go somewhere new. And when we can start to think about it that way and kind of empathize, from parent to parent, in my case, it can help us to humanize, and to recognize that we have people here that we're talking about, and these policies are impacting people every day and in very different ways. So I think it's really essential that we understand both the direct paths of immigration as well as those indirect paths. So that's I will talk about with policy right now, but I do think these are two really great reads if this is of interest to you. You might remember Sonia Shaw. She also wrote a book called Pandemic years ago, well before the COVID pandemic. So last but not least, as I said, I do have some ways to get involved, but we're running out of time. So I want to skip to some moments of hope. So there were two that really stand out in my mind. And the first came when I was still working in the detention facility back in November of 2018. So I mentioned there were these 38 families that had had their children taken from them, had been reunited, and were detained in this facility for 5 months, more than 5 months. So at the end of the week, we found out that 29 of these families were getting released. So it's sort of miraculous that it happened when I was there. And we had been scrambling kind of all week to get things lined up, transportation, et cetera. And at the very end, we had this meeting with all 38 families, the women and their children, and the head attorney, who was not a volunteer, but she was kind of the head of the project. And this one woman got up and just started talking about how she was so proud of all of her sisters. She was so proud and so thankful for the time that they had shared together. And she went around and talked about how each woman was going to make such a difference in the world. And so it's really incredible speech, this really incredible moment. She went around and pointed to all of the attorneys and all of the volunteers and talked about how we were angelitos that had been sent by God to support women, and her while she was there. And it was just really this incredibly moving moment. And I found out, pretty much everyone was in tears and choked up by her just compassionate speech and talk. And I found out right afterwards that she was actually one of the 9 women that was not getting released. And so this was not only something that she was sharing with all of these other women, but she was sharing these kind of ideas of strength and hope as someone who was not getting released and had really no expectation of getting released. It wasn't clear when she would get released because she wasn't part of this group that was getting released. So it was really incredible act of just sheer hope and just very moving sentiments that she shared with the group. And then the other one, again, which I'll talk about very, very briefly because I know we're close to out of time, is I had a 4th grader at the time, the same age as Tomas, the boy that had been separated from his mother. And at one point, I had shared with my children what I was doing, and I talked about some of the stories, and we had a number of conversations at dinner. And at one point, my daughter's 4th grade teacher called me and said, we were talking about Japanese internment camps in social studies, and your daughter mentioned the work that you had done in Texas, and we were wondering if you'd come and talk to the class. And so I said, sure, I'd be happy to. So I came. It was a December day, just about a month after I got back, and I came, and I was, fourth graders. They're kind of squirrely. They were giving up their lunch. It was optional, so I thought I would have just a small group of my daughter, really, and her friends who felt like they had to see me. But in fact, all of the fourth graders chose to give up their lunch to hear the stories of women and children. And not only did they give up their lunch, they gave up their recess. Well, they ate lunch in the classroom, gave up their recess. I had probably 5 or 6 students come up after, show the 4 or 5 pages of notes that they had taken. And I talked for, I think, 70 minutes without them losing interest, fidgeting, nothing like that. I thought I'd have to talk for a minute. We'd do some jumping jacks. I'd go back, we'd talk again, trying to keep their attention. But in fact, they were so engrossed. They continued to ask questions well beyond the time that had been set aside. And so I found that to be a true moment of hope, just in terms of, again, the compassion and the care and the empathy. So I like to end on those 2 moments because I know this is a really difficult topic. So that's where I like to stop. So I'm going to stop sharing now and see if we have any questions in the chat. And if we do not, but if people do have questions, because I think we're out of time, Matthew, is that right? Looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. I do see one question there.
Oh, good.
And so we will make sure Megan has a chance to respond to that via email. We have another session beginning here in just a few minutes. She's going to offer the same presentation in Spanish. So we want to give her a moment to catch her breath and take a drink of water. But Megan, thank you so much for what you shared with us. I'm glad my camera was off because you, at the beginning, you said it's hard to hear stories of human suffering. And I was very moved by what you shared, and thankful for those resources that you pointed us to. Of course, we here at the library would be happy to help you, our viewers, get access to those books and any other information you would like. And so thank you for coming. And as a part of the Illinois Humanities Road Scholar Program, there is a survey that you can complete. So I've just put that in the chat again. So if you would, those who are tuning in from home, if you would follow that link and fill out that brief 9-question multiple choice survey, that would be very helpful for us and for our friends who made this program possible. Megan, thank you again for sharing your time with us and these powerful stories and clarifying information. Really
yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. And I did just want to real quickly address the question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I'm not sure if it'll be possible to get that answer. I mean, I'm happy to type out an answer too, but I really appreciate that question, this idea of when it became incorrect for migrants to come to the US. That's a really fascinating history, the history of immigration policy and sort of who has been allowed in and not allowed in, and when did it even become that there was such a thing as legal versus illegal immigration, and the very different experiences that people have based on policy and sort of timing of when people or when ancestors came to the United States. It's very true that we have had programs encouraging migrant workers to come to the United States. And in particular, I think of the Bracero program that really depended on laborers coming primarily from Mexico. But then as soon as we don't need them, that's when we see the tightening of restrictions, very tightly controlled accessibility to citizenship and things like that. So it is very much a dance, as as Becky mentions. But I think, if it's something of interest to you, I definitely think a deeper dive into immigration policy is really eye-opening, especially when we look at it through kind of a lens of racial equity and thinking about what countries are kind of privileged in the immigration process and what countries aren't, and when that happened over time. So it's a great question and lots to say, but not enough time.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks to those who have tuned in. We'll take a pause here and then come back for our Spanish session.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.